Hello, welcome to Civic Buzz, a program of the League of Women Voters Minneapolis. Thank you for your interest in educating yourself on this topic and for attending tonight. I'm Ellen Van Iwarden, Program Director for the League, and I'll be moderating our presentation. The League is a nonpartisan political organization that encourages informed and active participation in all levels of government, works to increase understanding of major policy issues, and influences public policy through education and advocacy. I'm thrilled to be helping the League with this critical work and encourage you, if you are not already a member, to join us. You can find out more at lwvmpls.org. This fall, in addition to choosing their mayor and city council members, voters in Minneapolis will have the opportunity to shape our city's future with their votes on 3 ballot questions that propose changes to the city charter. Last week, we had League experts Patricia Koval-Jarboe and Catherine Shreves to tell us about ballot question 1, the proposed government structure charter amendment. The week before, we heard the League's Reimagining Public Safety Committee co-chairs, Jane Lansing and Jennifer Wilson, talking about ballot question 2, the public safety amendment. The recordings of both those Civic Buzz events will be on the website. The public safety is there already, and we're expecting the government structure any day. Tonight, we'll be learning about ballot question 3, the proposed rent control amendment. To give us the perspective from both sides of this issue, I'm honored to present Jennifer Arnold of United Renters for Justice, Ginger Jensen of Minneapolis United for Rent Control, and Cecil Smith of the Sensible Housing Ballot Committee. Before I introduce our presenters, and thank you so much for being here, I want to just throw in a quick League announcement from our Voter Services Committee, and that is that we're looking for volunteers to help distribute the voter guide that the League puts together. At the end of tonight's presentation, I'll share my screen with contact info on how you can do that if you'd like to help. Thanks so much. So back to our presenters and tonight's show. Jennifer Arnold is a talented tenant elected leader at United Renters for Justice. Her work is infrastructure focused. Jennifer directs finances, staff hiring and management, funder relations, coalition building, alley coordination, public relations, and campaign visibility. Jennifer Jensen is a member of Socialist Alternative, who ran for city council in 2017, fighting for rent control. She is a regular volunteer on the steering committee with Minneapolis United for Rent Control, a coalition that includes nurses, teachers, transit workers, community organizations, and faith groups. Cecil Smith is president and CEO of the Minnesota Multi-Housing Association, having served since February 2020. Previously, he was board chair of the association during 2017-18. He is currently chair of the Sensible Housing Ballot Committee, opposing rent control ballot measures in both Minneapolis and St. Paul. Thank you all. Each of the 2 sides will have up to 30 minutes to present, and then we'll have a Q&A period. Please put your questions in the Q&A section, not in the chat. Thank you again, and Jennifer and Ginger, you'll be up first, so take it away.
Thank you so much, Ellen, and thanks to the League of Women Voters to host this today. Very excited about it. Like Ellen said, my name is Jennifer Arnold, and I'm co-founder and co-director of Inquilinos Unidos por Justicia, or Tenants United for Justice. We are a renter organization in Minneapolis that was founded in 2015. And I just want to start out by saying that I'm super excited to be here. I'm really excited this is on the ballot. Our membership since the beginning of our organization has been asking for a rent control measure. And it's just been a question of figuring out how to get there. Our members have always cared about renter issues, and the thing that most impacts our members, who are primarily Black, Indigenous, and people of color, is the cost of rent. and the greatly increasing cost of rent. So I'm going to start out today just by presenting a little bit about why we're here in the first place, what's happening with housing, what's happening with the housing crisis specifically. And then I will pass it to Ginger to talk through the basics of a rent control policy and really what we'd be looking at here in Minneapolis, and then to debunk some of the myths that have surfaced about these kinds of policies. So I'm going to share my screen so I can show you all some of the basics of the data. So this wasn't super clear in the introduction as well, but I'm co-director of Inquilinos Unidos por Justicia, and we are part of the Home to Stay Coalition that's working to pass Question 3. And Ginger is part of the Minneapolis United for Rent Control, which is also working to pass Question 3. So we are aligned on that. So I just want to start out by giving a landscape of the Minneapolis housing market. So everybody knows, Minneapolis is now a renter majority city. And that was not always the case. We are 51% renter here in Minneapolis. And the renter population has grown 13% since 2000. This change has happened since 2000. And the majority of the people who rent are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. 80% of Black families rent, 80% of Native American families, 75% of Latino families, and 66% of Asian households. So this is, we need to ground ourselves in the fact that this is a racial justice issue. When we talk about who rents and protections for renters, we are talking about protections for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And this slide also has some really helpful data on it about the increase in rent and how it's impacting people. So rents in Minneapolis have increased greatly, really in the 2010 decade. And as you can see in this graph on the bottom right, 78% of renters are cost burdened by rent, which means they pay more than 30% of their income on rent. And 46% of renters in Minneapolis pay more than 50% of their income on their housing. And that is money that is directly taking away from food stability and from families' ability to do other things. This is a very, very serious issue. And this next set of charts actually describes really clearly the rent increases that have happened from 2010 to 2017. And just so you all know, this information comes from the Minnesota Housing Partnership. They've done a recent study on the market in Minneapolis. And so as you can see, studio apartments, the rent increase was 23% or more than 23%, whereas overall 17%. And this is really important to notice because incomes are not increasing at all, right? And so what it means when rent increases at this rate is that it directly impacts families' ability to get by. And I just want to name, I've had a question before, can't the market handle this kind of increase if it's happening and people are moving in? And I feel like I need to name this because it's sort of a common myth about the housing market. Housing is not like a regular good because housing is a need. If families don't have housing, they're homeless. And so people will do everything that they can to stay in a home. That means doubling up, that means get another job. And we see this all the time with our membership. I know members of ours that work 3 jobs and have a hard time seeing their kids because just to make sure that their family has a home. And Cura from the University of Minnesota did a report last year for this year for Minneapolis City Council, specifically on rent control and the Minneapolis market. And as you can see in this report, they found that from 2000 to 2019, tenants in the bottom quartile, which means the 25% most affordable housing, saw a steep rent increase. So 44% rent increase from 2006 to 2019. So when I'm talking about the increase of rent that people have seen, it's actually been in the most affordable rents. There are still vacancies in luxury buildings. The vacancy rates there are 6% or 8%, but the vacancy rates in the most affordable housing is under 1%. And that's where we've seen the rent increases. And so this means that we are impacting the people who are struggling the most to get by. And again, this slide talks about Black, Indigenous, and people of color renters generally, and Black households in particular, particular are suffering from these impacts. And I think it's really important here to name the history of housing in the United States and in Minneapolis specifically, right? It's built off the oppression of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So housing starts with the land grabs of the colonization. And then we have racial housing covenants, which is a very common thing in Minneapolis, and redlining, where banks actually supported the racial housing covenants. And then we have the subprime mortgages that were targeted to communities of color and the Great Recession. And now we have this increasing housing crisis that is a direct result of increasing rents. And so that's really the issue that we are talking about today. That's why we're talking about a rent stabilization, a rent control policy at all. And the last thing I want to name in this presentation about the housing crisis in Minneapolis is that increasingly we are seeing money outside of Minneapolis coming in to own our city. The rise of, as you can see here, this is a report actually from Who Owns the Twin Cities from June. I actually don't remember who put this out, but I have a link here. Specifically, private equity and investors from outside the Twin Cities area are coming in and grabbing single family homes. And Inquilinos Unidos, Tenants United for Justice has specific experience with this. We are organizing with renters who rent from Havenbrook Homes, which is owned by a private equity company called Pretium Partners. Pretium Partners is the second largest single family homeowner in the country. They own over 50,000 single family homes. And the way that they built their portfolio actually matters here. Havenbrook Homes started acquiring homes that were foreclosed in the 2008 crisis. And so specifically, Black families that were targeted by subprime mortgages lost their home in the crash in 2008, and Havenbrook Homes started to grab those homes. So they own homes all over the Twin Cities, but their biggest concentration is on the north side of Minneapolis. And this was specifically, this was purposeful, right? So now there are blocks in North Minneapolis, there are neighborhoods where this company owns 2 or 3 homes on a block. So not only now do families who used to be able to own their homes, now they are renting. Havenbrook Homes is the biggest evictor during the pandemic. They are increasing rents on folks regularly, and they're a direct barrier to Black families being able to own homes in their neighborhoods because they're holding these homes that used to be, owned by families. So it's really important to watch this transition, and so it also requires, intervention in the market. The housing market left to itself is not a market that cares about people. And you can see this in our rising amount of people living outside on the street. And an intervention like rent stabilization or rent control is a direct response to that. And I'm going to pass it to Ginger in a minute, but I just want to name that rent control policies are the most cost-effective policies to implement and the most universal and effective policies of all policies that address affordability. And they're not the only thing. They will not resolve our housing crisis entirely. They are one piece of a puzzle, but they are a very important piece because they allow for a balance in power between landlords and tenants. And they give, and they're a blanket that can support everybody to be able to stay in their homes. So I'm going to pass it now to Ginger to really walk you through how these policies work and to debunk some myths.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jen, for getting us started. And yeah, you'll notice, I'm Ginger and I'm from Minneapolis United for Rent Control, which is a grassroots coalition that's working on this particular issue. And so we've been doing a lot of work with Inquilinos over the past couple of years, of course. And I think, you'll hear us say rent control, rent stabilization, we're talking about fundamentally interjecting, into this let the market decide approach that Jen was just talking about. You can't just leave the housing market up to its own devices. And so what would this look like, a strong rent control policy? We would be talking about, linking it to something like the consumer price index, but approximately no more than a 3% increase in any given year, like what we're seeing in the St. Paul proposal, right? St. Paul is moving forward with a proposal for strong rent control. In Minneapolis, we have this two-step process where this year we have to vote on opening the path for rent control, while we also, I think, are talking about what does it look like to be fighting for the strongest possible rent control that's going to actually have its desired effects, as Jen was describing. So we're talking about it being universally applied and having it be applied to the unit and not the renter. And in other parts of the country, like New York, this is described as vacancy decontrol, right? So when it's applied to the renter, you'll hear these horror stories of someone moving out and then suddenly the rent gets jacked up, 1,000%, something like this, and that's what vacancy decontrol is. So we don't want to have that type of loophole that creates pockets of instability in a rent control policy and in a city. So that leads me to why we don't want to have any carve outs or exemptions for new construction or building size. Universal policy is the best and easiest to enforce. We find, and I can get into some of these questions about new construction, but also it's smaller landlords who also are not the ones we're seeing doing the price gouging that actually necessitate something like a rent control policy. But keeping it a universal is the best way that we can possibly keep it a strong policy as well. We also want to include protections against the amounts that landlords can pass renovation and repair fees onto tenants. And that's a crucial part of what I think Jen was also describing in terms of how people get priced out of a building, or how a landlord sometimes justifies unnecessary or exorbitant rent increases. So that's something I think we've also seen in other cities where there are protections against this type of thing, which I'll also get into a little bit later. We also would want this to be retroactively applied from whenever it's passed to avoid price gouging. So we don't want the corporate landlords to sort of raise the rents 100%, something like that, to try and lock it in at a much higher rate. And fundamentally, as Jen was also indicating, we're talking about actually shifting a lot of this balance of power in the kind of renter-landlord relationship in the housing market by having this also enforced by a well-resourced renters board, so that we could actually negotiate and discuss and debate if we are going to pass rent increases in any given year, also making sure that the policies are being enforced properly, and that renters are fundamentally playing a big role in talking about what housing looks like in our city. Press this and then go on. Okay. So we're also talking about maybe myth number one. What about new development, and will rent control stop new buildings from being built? And this is just something that gets pushed by the real estate lobby across the country. It is absolutely a myth from the beginning. And there are multiple studies that show that there's no evidence that rent control policies decrease development, right? The example given here, there's a lot of text, I know, but the example given here is in New York City, the two largest building booms actually took place during periods of extremely strict and strong rent control. So the 1920s, and then of course the post-war period between 47 and 65. And of course, there's more recent studies, as alluded to here, with UC Berkeley researchers finding that the 6 cities that had rent control in the Bay Area actually were producing more housing units per capita than the cities without rent control. So in fact, the policy does not do that at all. Rent control doesn't interfere with development. It doesn't prevent new construction. And as Jen was sort of saying in the beginning, it's a bit like a minimum wage for a renter, right? It's a guarantee that you're not going to see the type of price gouging that is so often displacing people from our cities. And of course, like the Kira study found that if we had had a rent control policy like what I just described, 3% cap, universally applied without these kinds of, corporate exemptions or loopholes, since 2009, we would not have the dramatic racial disparities that we have today in the housing market. At least that would have gone a long way toward trying to address the housing market that we have in Minneapolis, because we would not have seen the dramatic kind of price gouging and displacement from the fallout of the economic crisis in 2008, as Jen was also talking about. And even with that, even with this 3% cap, investors are still going to be making a profit. So it's also not true that this will end housing as we know it in that respect. So the other thing, another myth that comes up quite frequently is, won't landlords leave? And so kind of to that last point, they haven't left other cities where there are strong rent control policies or where they've been, passed previously, or anywhere else where rent control is passed. And of course, whenever there is any attempt to regulate or frankly, put more power in the hands of renters and ordinary working people in our cities. The real estate lobby always threatens to leave, and they scaremonger that any regulations will make their businesses unprofitable. And it's just not true. It's not found in the data anywhere or anything like that. And again, like the numbers are on the slide, but we're still seeing an average of 8% profit with a 3% cap. And at the same time, small landlords are not the ones we're usually seeing price gouging either. So again, it's the larger entities, it's the Hornigs, it's the corporate landlords in our city and state who are the ones who are trying to make the most money possible off of every individual unit. The small landlords are usually the ones who are raising rent maybe 2 and 3% in any given year to be able to make necessary repairs, but they're not doing it in the same way that these corporate landlords are, or a lot of the entities represented by Cecil at the Multifamily Housing Association. So I think myth 3 is another thing that you'll hear a lot. Like I said, small landlords will suffer under rent control. I mean, whether we're talking about small landlords or whether you're renting from a larger entity, it's a lifeline for any struggling renter in any given city. And it's a crucial tool to address our housing crisis, as Jen was talking about. But again, these small landlords we're commonly seeing are the ones who are still making a little bit of money, a little bit of profit on top, but are also putting away enough to be able to make the necessary repairs without price gouging people. So fundamentally, we're looking at trying to organize with renters across the city. We are building, I think, for question 3 in terms of, opening this path for rent control. Our coalition is building up, strength with not just renters, but working in middle-class homeowners, small landlords as well, who are seeing no threat in this policy that could actually rein in a lot of the way that these sort of bigger investors from outside the city or folks from the Multifamily Housing Association are sort of gobbling up the whole market of rental properties, right? And through all of this, we're talking about getting organized in a grassroots way that is about empowering renters and working people to actually advocate for their own interests in buildings across the city. So, we're fighting evictions, we're fighting to build high quality, affordable housing that people deserve in the city of Minneapolis as a part of this fight overall too. And so the fourth thing I would say is if we get rent control in Minneapolis, won't landlords stop taking care of their buildings? And I think, again, all of these are sort of wrapped in similar types of fears, right? And so in cities like New York, like I was saying in the beginning, we don't want to have rents go up in exorbitant amounts when landlords are trying to pass on renovation or repairs fees. So in the city of New York, actually, there's an $89 cap to rent increases for renovations, and then those have a 30-year limit, right? So other cities are talking about ways in which they can cut across this type of skirting of stronger rent control policies. And there's an example here, right, where there were 52 buildings owned by 3 landlords that were doubling their renovation fees. And then we've seen in industry magazines, of course, landlords bragging about spending $1,000 on cosmetic repairs to justify like $300 a month increases. Like this is the stuff that we're talking about trying to cut across with a strong rent control policy. Now, again, like I'm not saying that every landlord in the city is doing these types of things, but the point is, if you have any big entity that is thinking that they can get away with this type of thing, then they're kind of setting the standard for how everyone else is going to see that they're allowed to treat renters in the city. So fighting for these kinds of strong rent control policies is a key part of empowering, again, working class communities to be able to advocate in their own interests. We also see that with rent control, renters are often way more aware of what their rights are as renters, right? So in cities like San Francisco, where you're sort of negotiating with your landlord over what any sort of increase would look like and whether or not it's legal, we just see a lot more people empowered by these strong renter laws, knowing that they're protected, and they're protected by a well-resourced renters board. So the last thing I would say is, what about other cities and would rent control work here? And I mean, again, I think what we're looking at is this is a veritable lifeline for renters in the cities where it exists to prevent them from being displaced and so that they know what their rights are. And again, like this sort of question of vacancy decontrol in New York City that removes rent control once a tenant moves out, like that's a key thing we want to try and not have in any sort of rent control policy in Minneapolis. We want to make sure that it's tied to the apartment itself, not the renter, so that if there are improvements made, this doesn't actually kick people out of what would otherwise be affordable rent controlled apartments, right? And of course, the statistic used here is that, vacancy decontrol, when it was passed in New York, actually it dramatically decreased the number of affordable units, of rent-controlled units for ordinary people in the city. This is why we don't support, these bigger loopholes that have existed in other places, and would do everything that we can to build the movement necessary to prevent this from happening. Again, what we're talking about tonight in some respects is opening the path to be able to have this discussion around what rent control would look like in the city of Minneapolis. But we see a lot of the arguments coming from the Multifamily Housing Association, from the sensible group that Cecil is representing tonight. A lot of them are making these arguments that are actually fundamentally, not an honest approach to how rent control actually works in other cities, let alone how it would work in the city of Minneapolis, backed up by real data that mean that working class people and immigrants and people of color and the Black community and working in the city of Minneapolis would actually be able to continue to live in the city of Minneapolis and wouldn't be displaced by the type of price gouging that we're seeing in this market. The other thing I would say too is that, again, like a lot of these organizations that Cecil's representing tonight have done everything that they can to fight against even pandemic relief and eviction defense for renters across the country. And over the weekend, there was a New York Times article that showed that a lot of the eviction moratoriums and eviction policies that were passed across the country to help renters during this pandemic actually reduced the number of pandemic deaths by 11%. And just think what would have been possible if we had actually passed those eviction moratoriums much sooner. How many lives could have been saved in this context had these types of real estate lobby groups not actually fought very necessary protections for renters in this climate. So this is the type of thing that we're trying to do. We're trying to further empower renters to represent themselves and ourselves. I'm a renter myself, in the context of a housing market that is quite unfriendly most of the time to keeping people in their cities. And so that's what we're talking about tonight. So thank you so much for allowing us to present, and I look forward to the discussion and the questions.
Thank you, Ginger. And Cecil, it's your turn. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you to the League of Women Voters for hosting this forum. Wow, that was a lot of things, and more than I just thought it would be about rent control. So yeah, let me tell you about the Minnesota Multi-Housing Association and the Sensible Housing Ballot Committee, because that's been characterized already, and I need to address that. So the Minnesota Multi-Housing Association is made up of mostly local owners and operators. It was formed by local owners and operators over 50 years ago. And those owners came together because they wanted to professionalize the industry, certainly as people's portfolios were growing. And they wanted to provide a high level of professionalism and service and quality housing in the market, and to advocate for that. And they have a long history for 50 years of doing that. And in terms of the pandemic, that culminated last year, where before the governor even issued his eviction moratorium order, there was a hurriedly arranged meeting over the weekend as the pandemic and the public health crisis was emerging. And we issued a self-imposed moratorium, preempting the governor, to say, it's very clear we're in the middle of a public health crisis and we're not going to evict anybody. We're not going to charge late fees. We're going to take care of our customers, because contrary to what is sometimes characterized, we're in the business of renting. We're in the business of giving people a place to call home and filling up the empty units in our buildings, if they happen to be empty, with renters, because that's good for business and it's good for our customers. And it's good to build strong communities. And we're very proud of the communities that we build across the state in multifamily housing. And that's become an increasing emphasis as we have realized that as we help build human connections in communities, that's good for business. We get lower turnover, people stay in their homes, and they have a sense of community with their neighbors. And that's what our industry is about. And we're passionate about that. We advocate strongly for that. we have a strong code of ethics, and we enforce that and teach it to our members. We don't have, we're not perfect. Nobody is. People make mistakes. And we try to train and develop best practices that folks in our industry can follow, so that people have a great place to call home and they get great service from the multi-housing industry. So we act in the interests of our customers. That's good business, and any industry tries to do the same, so that we can be proud of what we do because we live in this community. Most of our members still live here. This is where they're domiciled. They attend church, and they go to participate in civic organizations, even like the League of Women Voters, and actively engaged in this community. And so we're aware of that. We're aware of the needs and the concerns, and that makes us very aware of the housing affordability crisis that we have in our community right now. There is absolutely a problem, but rent control is not the solution. It's the worst solution, especially the proposal that Ginger's just outlined. It's not strong rent control, it's strict rent control. Probably the strictest. Nobody's yet found one that's stricter than what has been suggested here tonight. And certainly what is on the ballot in St. Paul, which, as Ginger and Jennifer mentioned, mirrors what they've just outlined for Minneapolis is on the ballot in St. Paul, with a few other things added in, which is the retroactive date and so forth. So let's talk about the elements of the proposal. So 3% without an inflationary adjustment, we haven't seen that tried anywhere before. Oregon just implemented a rent control policy, and it was 7% plus CPI. Different Californian cities have a certain percentage plus CPI. Vacancy control, we believe only exists in one other place. Most other cities have vacancy decontrol. And certainly in terms of new production, we're not aware of anybody that has imposed rent control on new development. So when Ginger talks about new development still happening in San Francisco and New York with rent control, well, that's because they exempted it for the first 15 years of the time that since the property was constructed, and then rent control phases in on the property. But this proposal that they're discussing includes rent control on all property types, from single family homes that are 100 years old to the garden level low-rise buildings that we see all across Minneapolis, to the brand new developments. And in that sense, it is a very broad sweeping measure, because not only does it sweep up the low income households, but it also includes luxury product. So in terms of targeting resources, targeting policy, rent control is a very blunt instrument. It provides a benefit to households who probably don't need it, and it provides a benefit to certainly, and I'll definitely concede this, rent control helps the existing renters. There's no question across the world that existing renters are helped by rent control. It's the new renters, the next renters, who are harmed because there's no new place to live that they can afford. They're displaced out of their communities that they've grown up in. And this is what we've seen in places like San Francisco and New York, where there's been displacement of communities in cities that have rent control. The Mission District used to be a Latinx community. in San Francisco, it no longer is. Rent control often brings about gentrification, which is the very thing it's trying to stop, attempting to halt. So one of the concerns that also exists with this policy is that then there's a mechanism that's offered. Can we go? You can go and still get a return, right? If this is too harsh, too strict. But how do you do that with 25,000 rental licenses in Minneapolis? How do you manage that on an annual basis? The city can't even inspect all the properties on an annual basis, let alone how do you process when inflation goes above 3%, which is very likely to happen this year, when costs are rising out of our industry's control, such as property taxes, which is one of the biggest cost drivers for our industry, or insurance, or utilities, some of which is also set by the city. And we have no control. Those are built-in costs that we cannot manage independently. And then that leads to deterioration because those bills have to be paid to keep the lights on, to keep the building heated, to keep it from tax forfeiture. And owners in rent control cities are forced to figure out how to pay the bills and how to keep the property running. And that means they delay capital improvements, they delay maintenance, they delay expenditures that are more flexible. But of course, over time, that leads to deterioration. And there was a great piece in today's Star Tribune talking about just this very phenomenon. Well, even while New York City was building new housing in the 1970s, 50,000 apartment units were being abandoned by their landlords. There was complete dereliction of housing stock under rent control. And so these are the unintended consequences that come out of any economic system that engages in price control. It's just a well understood principle that price controls don't work. They fail. The well-intentioned, I grew up in New Zealand, and during the 1970s inflationary crisis and oil shocks, they imposed price controls. They set price controls on everything. And it led to incredible market distortions where there was black market gasoline, and there was ways in which people were trying to circumvent through off-market dealings to work around price control systems. So price controls, like rent control, are a very blunt tool to try and solve our affordable housing crisis. In fact, as I said earlier, it can often have the opposite effect. So what are the solutions, right? We need more housing. If we apply economic principles, laws of supply and demand, the way you affect pricing is to add more supply, right? If you constrain supply, and demand continues to exist, prices rise. So we need to inject more supply into the market. And certainly on cost burden households, and I want to address what Jennifer and Ginger were saying about cost burden households. So the Cura study that they look at, where they looked at low-income households, there was wage stagnation. It's very clear on page 63 that there's just incredible wage stagnation that has affected our low-income communities, even while rents were rising modestly. So, Jennifer talked about the rent increases. Well, those rent increases were averaging 3% or less. So when you take that 23% over 8 years, it's 3%, right? So there's modest increases that were happening, but there's still wage stagnation. So that it puts incredible pressure on these families. And if we instituted rent control, they're still cost burdened. There's still all those people at 50% cost burdened on rent. Even if we institute a rent control tomorrow, they would still be cost burdened. We have to do something about income, or the income supports, direct renter assistance, other systems that target resources to where it's needed. And certainly the creation of affordable housing, housing that's focused on deeply affordable, such as 30% AMI or less. And this is where the role of government comes in, right? So the market cannot build housing and pencil it out so that the rents will meet the costs, both the financing and the operation costs of properties where rents are affordable at 30% AMI. It's just impossible. It doesn't, the cost of materials, labor, land, you just can't do it. Even with the incredibly low interest rate environment we have right now, which I believe is an incredible historic opportunity that we have, that we've been missed for the last 20 years as we've had increasingly declining interest rates, which those of us that lived through the 70s understand it can get very scary when you have a 15% mortgage, and those things are real. And that's real. That's a real interest rate risk to our industry, because we don't get 30% more, 30-year mortgages, I should say, 30-year mortgages at fixed rates. We get commercial mortgages with interest rates that fluctuate, whether the mortgage is 5 years, 7 years, or 10 years at the end of that term. And that's the interest rate exposure that has to be absorbed. So quantity of housing is diminished under rent control. The quality of housing is diminished under rent control. And the other thing that happens is we get displacement, because communities that have existed do not have new places to live. We added 50,000 people, nearly 50,000 people in Minneapolis over the last 10 years. We need to build housing units for the next 50,000 people that are coming. And if we institute this kind of rent control, we will not get that new housing built. We will not have the housing supply that's needed. And then you get displacement. And the way that happens is Minnesotans are value shoppers when it comes to housing. It's a very smart thing. It's a very wise thing that individual households do, because they're looking for the best deal possible. We all love a deal. And when you can find housing that's even more affordable than what you can afford, something that's cheaper than what you can afford, Minnesotans tend to take that opportunity. I learned this while I was in the governor's housing task force. But of course, this puts pressure at the lowest pricing in the market, because you've got folks who can afford housing at 50% AMI shopping for housing that's affordable at 30% AMI, and competing with folks who can only afford 30% AMI, area medium income. We need to offer more housing at those kinds of price points to take that pressure off. Rent control does not produce any of that kind of housing. And when we've got the possibility of rent control, we've seen in other cities, San Francisco in particular, 15% decline in available rental units. Well, how does that come? We started with, how do we end up with fewer rental units when we get rent control than what we started with? Well, that's because of condo conversions. So the only way in which there can be a reasonable exit strategy under rent control is to convert the property to condos. Sell the property off, entitle each unit, and sell them off one by one. And you end up with a reduction in available housing. So between the pricing pressure on the available affordable housing, because we've got value shoppers, the reduction in the number of rental units, we end up with a deeper housing crisis. And who is going to be hurt the most? Our poorest, low-income BIPOC communities. That's who's going to be hurt. And so I do believe this is a race equity issue. And I really feel that we need to be very, very careful. And that's why we're urging people to vote no on question 3, because this is the wrong solution to the problem that's been identified, and it's a real problem. We need other solutions that produce housing at the lowest, for the lowest income levels and across the whole spectrum. We just need to build, continue to build and add supply into the market. So there were a few myths that were thrown out. We haven't threatened to leave. We're trying to stay here and build a strong market, robust economy where there's jobs, where jobs are paying more, where people have a place to live and build community. We're here. The Minnesota Multi-Housing Association is here. The members of the Sensible Housing Ballot Committee that was announced today, which includes labor, realtors, other business groups. We're coming together to say it's the wrong solution. We've got to get the right solution for our community so we can maintain housing affordability and help those who can't afford their housing right now. And to get to the price gouging. So other industries are regulated against price gouging. Rent control is a blunt instrument against price gouging. There are consumer protection laws and price gouging laws and policies that other industries are subjected to. And those are the kinds of policies that are more directed and focused if we want to deal with the problem of price gouging, because then there can be a real examination of what's really happening in the circumstance. Because often the situation where people describe that there's price gouging is it's a rundown building. The building has not had capital investment for a period of time. An investor comes in and the best housing that we have, the cheapest and the best that we have is the existing housing stock. They reinvest into that housing stock. They add value. They improve the roofs, the windows, the boilers. They fix the building. Still has good bones, but we fix the building. That investment has to be recouped. Sometimes that gets called price gouging, and there's quite possibly circumstances where people have tried to exploit that beyond what is reasonable. Let's apply consumer protection laws in those circumstances. But if somebody has made an effort to improve our existing housing stock and use their private dollars to do that, that's a good thing for our community, because that's a capital reinvestment back into our existing housing stock, which is the cheapest way to provide housing in our city, rather than what I see in Dallas, where they build for planned obsolescence. It's terrible. I can't believe that they build planning that, the life cycle of this building is probably less than 50 years. That's a terrible waste of resources, both environmentally, but just even morally. Like, housing should be built to last. Let's create housing for the long term. And that's why, I'm excited about what has happened over the last 10 years with so much housing being built in our city. But we need to build a lot more. And these kinds of policies are going to deter investment. I'm already aware of investments and deals in St. Paul that are on ice right now, waiting. They're on hold. They're waiting till November 3rd to see the outcome, because there is enormous risk attached to purchasing a property right now in St. Paul, knowing that rent control could be instituted. And so people are waiting. It's massive uncertainty. If it was going to be such a good deal, the deals would be going through. People would be buying. Apartments are a great investment right now. But because nobody wants to buy a shopping mall or an office building after the pandemic. But even in St. Paul, there is a pause. People are waiting because these proposals will deter the investments that we need to be making, both with private capital, and that makes it even harder for the government to be able to respond to the situation in Minneapolis. So I'll end there. We can go to questions. That's a little bit of my rebuttal, but that's what we're asking for, to vote no, because vote no on question 3 in Minneapolis is a rebuttal to the proposal that we should have rent control. We shouldn't be a rent control city. It hasn't worked in any other place in the world. I just challenge anybody to tell me, where is there a city in the world where there are affordable rents that has rent control? Because I haven't found one.
Thank you all. It's wonderful to hear from you. And we already have a lot of questions. The first is from Susan Barrett. Who would make up a renter protection board? And I'll put that to Jennifer and Ginger.
Yeah, I can answer that question. A renter protection board, in our view, should be a board that is democratically elected and responsible to the voters in our city, and specifically responsive and responsible to renters in our city. We believe they're positions that should be voted in and that are majority renter.
Thank you. All right, the next question is for Ginger from Annie Hall. Ginger, there was an opinion piece in the Star Tribune today talking about problems in New York City with rent control, with buildings being abandoned and issues of banks not refinancing mortgages for property owners allegedly because of rent control. Can you speak to that and also talk about MURC apostrophe S, Merck's idea regarding having a city level pool of money that could be tapped by rental property owners to cover repairs and renovation?
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. And yeah, the MURC, Minneapolis United for Rent Control, sometimes it gets abbreviated that way. So yeah, no, it's great. Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's worth, we really haven't had much discussion around what a pool of money that could be tapped for property owners or what have you might look like, or whether or not to support something like that. But, the thing is, as we are looking at question 3 going into the fall and opening this path for rent control, we're trying to talk about what are the aspects of strong rent control that we would need to see to avoid the, pitfalls that have happened in other places, or like the sort of, I keep saying pockets of instability, but the ways in which rent control policies have been eroded over time by the real estate and landlord lobby, right? So like in the city of New York, for example, when we're talking about rent control and the different kind of versions of rent control, rent stabilization, ways in which renters are intended to be helped in the city, they're kind of constantly clawing back in policy from decades of the rent control policies that were passed in previous generations. And like I said, during those periods of like the 1920s and those big building booms in the 1930s and 40s, a lot of this is we're clawing back from what was previously strong rent control. And so what we're describing with this policy is I think a point at which we're just talking about what strong rent control would look like. But over the course of this year, we'd want to talk about like how to move forward with a policy through like mass community events, right? How do we talk about what people are willing to fight for in a strong rent control policy? And so that's one thing I think is worth talking about, is like, this is a way in which we've gathered together data from other parts of the country to talk about what strong rent control looks like. And I think we really want to talk about what are people willing to organize for over the course of the year to be able to win the strongest possible rent control for the city of Minneapolis. So this fall, we're opening up the path, and that's partly why we think it's important to talk about defining strong rent control right now, because it's coming up already in these opinion pieces and whatnot about kind of some of the ways in which people are, describing the ways in which rent control has been eroded over the years, right? So in terms of, I think this illustration, sorry, and I'm almost done, I'm rambling a bit, but in terms of this illustration, I think a lot of what gets described, and from what I could tell, I mean, I'm not 100% sure if we're looking at the same opinion piece, but describing, New York in the 1970s is actually talking about a very embattled city that was actually in a huge fiscal financial crisis, right? And the reason for that crisis was not because of rent control, but it was because of numerous reasons, like they were, over $11 billion in debt, in actual debt. And so then there were a lot of things that happened. New York of the 1970s is not the New York of today, right? There was a pension underfunding, and there were a lot of other issues that actually were part of that financial crisis that existed in New York. So people didn't leave because of the financial crisis. They certainly didn't leave because of rent control. And in fact, in the city, again, it's a huge lifeline for keeping people in the city of New York. And then in terms of today, I think what we're looking at is there is a lot of money going into investment, going into commercial buildings as well. I don't think that it's necessarily true that people aren't investing in those commercial properties. The Wall Street Journal talks about it. The New York Times talks about it. It's actually a really lucrative market at the moment for wealthier investors to kind of park their money for the moment while they were waiting for the pandemic to be over and for people to return to work. So the other thing is we're not seeing that kind of abandoning of cities like what might have been predicted. And partly that's because of the pandemic protections that were implemented over the last year. So I think it's worth talking about that in the context of rent control, in part because of what are we trying to fight for? We needed rent control before this pandemic started, before there were these issues of a potential rents going up potentially in the wake of these eviction moratoriums being lifted and all of that. But now I would say it's an even more dire set of circumstances for most people in the country. So, yeah.
Thank you. The next question is for Cecil. Ginger described a proposal for rent increases that are tied to the consumer price index. Wouldn't that take care of concerns about inflation costs to rental property owners? And wouldn't it be possible to design a rent control policy that also takes into account property tax burdens, such as giving tax breaks? I don't think anyone is trying to propose a policy that is going to be unworkable over time.
Well, that's not what I heard Ginger say. She said capped at 3%. So CPI up to 3%. Is that what you said, Ginger?
Let's see. Ginger, Cecil is saying, did you propose a 3% cap or 3% plus CPI?
Not plus CPI. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, a 3% cap, like in St. Paul.
Yeah.
So other jurisdictions, as the questioner has asked, they have an inclusion of CPI into whatever is proposed for the cap on the increase. But this is what we're talking about. What's proposed tonight is CPI up to 3%. And we're probably looking at 5% inflation this year in the United States. We don't know what it will be next year. And the problem with the policy is that caps things is, what is it like in 10 years? Anybody who's has the crystal ball for where the economy is 10 years from now will know exactly where to make investments and will do very, very well. I wish I had that crystal ball, but I don't. So the way business operates is you work with the available information that you have to mitigate risk and to understand what risk you have. And there is inflationary risk. We can't keep adding debt the way we are without the potential for inflationary risk. Most people thought it would have happened by now with, over $20 trillion of debt, but it hasn't. But that potential exists. We've seen it with other countries that became highly indebted, that they've either they've seen incredible hyperinflation. I'm not predicting that, but there's just a risk. And when investors and owners and managers have to plan for risk, when you constrain and say, well, you're buttoned down on this to 3%, then when I'm looking at my refinance that's in 7 years' time, what's going to be my exposure? Because if I'm facing interest rates of 5, 6, 7, 8%, which is what my first mortgage was, 8%, then that's a huge challenge. That's a huge challenge to be able to keep the property financially sound. And this is the risk that rent control creates. And there's no mitigation for it other than to say, we're not going to invest.
Sorry, can I actually just come in and respond to that real quick?
Sure.
That'd be helpful. Thank you so much. So kind of as I understood the question, I think what this person is asking is whether or not we were talking about tying it to something that would be a predictable kind of metric, right? So this question of CPI, no, we're not talking about doing 3% plus CPI. We're talking about 3%, right? Like we want to do a 3% cap, but like what we could do is have it be connected to something like CPI. And so having it be something that's predictable and doesn't increase by more than 2 to 3% in any given year, that's what we're looking to do, right? We're looking to make sure that it's not just a predictable increase, but something that isn't going to, be like the 5, 6, 7%. And I think most economists right now are agreeing that the higher inflation that we're seeing in this moment isn't hyperinflation, and it's actually a temporary impact from the issues of supply chains and things that are still trying to be resolved through the pandemic. So most economists aren't worried about a long-term high inflation that we've seen, in the 1980s or something like that. And the other thing I would say to looking at other parts of the world in terms of when we pass a strong rent control policy and then try and change it or erode it or whatever, a lot of what we saw in New York over the years was renters trying to fight to keep the strong rent control policy. In Sweden recently, the government just passed a policy to try and now exempt new construction from their rent control proposal. It was previously part of their strong rent control. And actually that government was just deposed, right? So they've just removed that party from power because people in Sweden wanted to keep what they had already won, which was strong rent control, which is part of how they're able to stay in their homes. And so they didn't want that kind of erosion to their strong rent control policy, just to kind of address some of that global situation. And I think in terms of the investment, what we'd be talking about is something that would be predictable and small, right? So yeah, just thought
Thank you. Cecil, do you want to respond at all to that?
Well, I'll just say that Sweden has highly socialized housing. The government is the main housing provider, so it's not an apples to orange. It's not an apples to apples. It's an apples to orange comparison, which is the problem we keep having with this conversation around the proposal in Minneapolis that's presented tonight, or what's on the ballot in St. Paul, is it's never been done like this before. This is an experiment, and it's a massive social economic experiment. And I say social because it's about people's home. It's about stable communities. It's about making sure that we have some continued investment and commitment to creation of new housing opportunities in our city, and that's what's at risk. So I don't want to see this kind of experiment occur in our housing market, because there will be social dislocation and there will be economic destruction.
Thank you. We have the last question so far from an anonymous attendee, and I'll have both sides answer it. But why don't we start with Jennifer and Ginger? The question is, you addressed the concept of rent control, but not the how. The ballot question is asking us to vote for the council enacting a policy that we voters haven't seen. Would you please address this?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and actually points us to why we're in this place in the first place. So, with the renter organization that I work with, we have worked with the council to pass policy for 5 years. And generally, when renter protection policies are passed in the city of Minneapolis, the city council works on a policy with input from their constituents and writes it and passes it. That's how limited look back was passed, and limits to security deposits and other renter protections that have passed in the last 3 years. Because we have a preemption on the state level, there's a law in that blankets the state of Minnesota that was passed in the 80s, actually by the landlord lobby, saying that city councils cannot enact a rent stabilization ordinance or rent control ordinance. The only way to pass, according to that law, the only way to pass an ordinance is through referendum. And so right now, the vote that we're doing this fall is to satisfy that requirement that is in the state, that is a state law. And so if this, if the voters vote yes in November, then the council will be able to enact a policy just like they enact policies normally. And I am certain there will be lots of public discussion about that. The public discussion is starting now as we're talking about how the policy could look and what the contours of it are, and will continue if voters vote yes in November. And so the council will craft a policy based on what the community says. And so the things that Ginger and I are talking about are, a place to start the conversation, a place to say, this is what the strongest policy that would most protect renters would look like. That's not saying what it will actually look like, right? That is going to be a negotiation process that our council and our new council will work on, and you will all get a chance to have opinions about. And so really this is the setup that has happened because of what our state law looks like. And, I think St. Paul gives us a nice version to look at. And, they have a different situation. Here in the city of Minneapolis, because of our city charter, we're not allowed to vote on policy. So the change in November is a change to the charter to allow us to do that on this specific issue. So it's a little bit complicated, but we're threading the needle both of a state preemption and the city charter and what it requires us to do. I also want to name that the St. Paul policy is not the most stringent in the world. There's a policy in Berkeley that is tied to CPI that sometimes is 2% because of that. So, and again, this is a starting point where we're having a conversation, and this will need to be negotiated.
Thank you.
Yeah, it is because it is the strictest because Berkeley has vacancy decontrol. So great question, because we've been talking a lot about specifics of a policy, which is a bit theoretical. What is actual is the ballot question, which empowers the city council. And that is what voters are voting on. We can see the starting point for the conversation tonight about what the council might be considering. And we're urging voters to don't trust the city council with this. Don't trust the city council with the housing market. Don't trust the city council to enact a rent control measure. And so vote no on question 3. We are urging, that's the message of the Sensible Housing Ballot Committee. That's what we've been sharing with people about what the ballot measure says, what it does, and who would have the power and authority. And we're just saying, we don't need this policy, and we certainly don't need the city council creating it.
Thank you. All right, we have another question from an anonymous attendee, and I'll pose it to both sides again. Does the passing of question number 3 require a rent control plan be generated and voted on in the future? Why don't we start this time with Cecil?
The charter amendment that is on the ballot has 2 pathways. So it's a pathway forward for the creation of rent control, as Jennifer has been rightly pointing out. But there's 2 pathways. One is the city council would be empowered to create the rent control policy and put it into place by a vote of the voters, or they have the option of creating a policy which then they would put as a ballot question in a future election. Could be 2022, could be a future year. We're voting on changing the charter so that the council at any point in time in the future could enact rent control, or they could put it on a future ballot in the general election. And that would conform with the state law 4999 that Jennifer's been referencing. So that's those are the 2 options that are in the charter ballot question, and that voters are voting on specifically on the charter amendment. And so we'll see what option the council decides to take after the election.
I concur, very well described.
Agree on something. That's great.
Great. All right. So right now, we do not have any more questions in the chat. Are there any out there? We've got a great crowd tonight. Thank you so much.
How many people? I don't know. I can't see.
Yeah,
any.
we had 38 at the top moment. And so that's a great crowd.
Yeah, we're glad to have everybody with us. It's not just Jennifer and I having another conversation with Ginger tonight. So.
That's right. Yeah. Well, I want to thank all three of you for coming. This was so interesting and informative. We really appreciate it. An area that most of us have not known a lot about. And we appreciate you. Thanks so much.
Thanks for inviting us.
Yeah, thank you
Thanks
so
for
much for
having us.
having me.
Yeah.
Good.
Thanks for the conversation. Thank you, Jennifer and Ginger.
Good.
Thank you, Cecil.
And we'll say good night. If you're a league member, hang on for just a second while I share my screen with some information on a few volunteer opportunities we have from our incredible voter services team. So just one moment. Good night. I will get this. See if I can get this down here. All right. There we go. All right. Okay. So here we have the three volunteer opportunities we have this fall before the election. Delivering the voter guide, distributing get out the vote posters and voter guides in wards 4, 5, and 9, and also mailing get out the vote postcards. And all of this information was also in the update that was sent out to all members on September 29th. So you can also find the information there. But I'll leave it for a few minutes here. And I'm going to just bring it down here and find the Zoom again. And just see if we can share that. All right, there it is. There we go. And I'll put it back to number 1, distributing the voter guides. 2, distributing the get out the vote posters. And then 3, doing some get out the vote postcards. And thanks again to everyone for joining us tonight. Hope that's given you enough time to catch the email addresses. And of course, you could also check in with the office if you have more questions. Thanks again, and hope to see you next month for our presentation on homelessness. Good night.